I'm really happy to be here today and talking on behalf of the Sloane Lab, which is a project I'm working on. And the Sloane Lab is about connections at its very core, and especially the connections between people today and collections in museums, libraries, and archives. Because this project is about making this process more user-friendly. And by doing this, we can look forward to actually a really exciting future, because our work ensures that the new research that's going to be generated through our project, we can't even imagine it yet, and what's more exciting than that? This is the fantastic multidisciplinary team at the heart of the Sloane Lab, and our combined expertise in digital humanities, participation and curating is integral to our success. From a very technical point of view, we are looking at how best to link together different information organised in very different ways in different digital collections. And from the very start, we are asking how to knit this information together across and within digital collections that best help people find and make the connections that they want to make. And this is our starting point, asking how different people with different motivations search and use collections, then testing and retesting the ways we have mapped this data and knitted the collections together. You'll hear a lot of knitting, I like knitting, to see if this works for as many people as possible. This is central to our approach. And for this, we are using CDOC, which is Conceptual Reference Model, to do the technical work. And I say we, I'm a curator of South Asia. I know nothing about digital, really. So if you have any detailed digital questions, please ask my lovely colleagues, Julianne and Andreas, who are in the audience. So why Sloane? Well, our project is called Sloane Lab. There's a reason for it. And I will tell you who is Sloane and why are his collections so important to our project. Well, Sir Hans Sloane, you can see him in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide. He's very purposefully moved to one side. He's a physician, naturalist, and president of both the Royal Society and the Royal College of Physicians. And I know we have a very esteemed audience. I doubt we have presidents of both magical societies. But Sloane actually started collecting while he worked as a physician on slave plantations in Jamaica. And he relied on help from enslaved West Africans and English planters to do this. When he came to London, he set up a very successful medical practice, just minutes actually from where we are all sitting here right now. And he continued collecting on a massive scale. Sloane lived at a time of increasing European imperial expansion across the globe. These developing networks enabled him to collect globally, and his collection was partly financed with income derived from the enslaved labour on Jamaican sugar plantations, which his wife had inherited. Sloane bequeathed his entire collection to George II for the nation in return for a payment of £20,000 to his heirs, and on condition that Parliament create a new and freely accessible public museum to house it. This was done, we are standing in it, and the British Museum came into being in 1753. So Sloane's collection is one of the founding collections of the British Museum and therefore the Natural History Museum and the British Library. And I think it's interesting to note that Sloane's wish that his collections were freely accessible to all remains central not only to our project but also TANK. But, as I mentioned, this is not about Sloane, as my colleague Mark regularly reminds us. It's about his collections. Sloane collection sounds really simple and straightforward, but it's really very complex and very large. And it's a collection of collections that ranges from animal specimens to pressed plants, books, manuscripts, paintings, artifacts such as coins, medals, musical instruments, and everything you could possibly imagine in between. This material is held in 3 separate institutions: the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the British Library. The Sloane Lab team is working together to digitally knit together this material, and with, for the very first time, a digital version of the original 1753 collection and manuscript catalogues. As you can see from this slide, the numbers involved are enormous. So you've got around 70,000 objects and natural history specimens, around 50,000 books, manuscripts, prints and drawings, around 15,000 manuscript pages of Sloane's surviving handwritten catalogues. But as you also see in bright red, not everything survives. And that'll be important when we get to the end of my talk. All of these collections are classified, catalogued and digitised in different ways at the 3 institutions they are held in, and sometimes differently in the same institution, as is the case of animal and plant specimens at the Natural History Museum, for example. Stitching these collections, I also do sewing, hence the stitching, these past and present collections together digitally across institutions, classifications and catalogues is a complex and difficult task. You can see why we chose Sloane's collection. If we can overcome the challenges in digitally reconnecting this huge and wide-ranging collection, then the knowledge, techniques and technology can be applied to any collections and institutions, both in the UK and internationally. And there's also an additional point that I think is actually quite important here. Sloane's collections also help us understand and tell the complex story about Britain's connection with the world during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and the contested nature of museum collections today, while also contributing to the wider discussions about colonialism that are taking place across cultural organisations and society. And I think the Sloane Lab project is a very important part of this process. As I mentioned at the very start, Sloane Lab is underpinned by a collaborative participatory approach. It's part of what makes our project so different and so relevant. We are working with lots of different people who have a range of interests in the Sloane collection. For example, some members of the Jamaican diaspora want to know more about their ancestors' lives, experiences and knowledge. Botanists are interested in the plant specimens, including those that are now extinct. Children from Sloane's hometown of Killalea in Northern Ireland are learning about Sloane for the first time. And I have to say, perhaps unsurprisingly, they're particularly interested in chocolate and his connection with that. And creators like me, who are very interested in the earliest days of English involvement in India and what his collection can tell me about that. This is just a very tiny snapshot of interests in Sloane's collections, but it emphasises 2 key points. First, most people aren't necessarily interested in Sloane himself or of his collection as a collection. They are interested in specimens, books and objects themselves, and especially, this is really key, the stories contained within them. And this is our challenge. Because Sloane Lab is not only connecting collections across institutions and different classifications and catalogues, but exploring how these knitted together collections can be easily searched by anyone with their varying interests, and implementing this knowledge technically so that it keeps on improving as our knowledge and experience develops through our project. The Sloane Lab knowledge base is central to this because it stores all of the data collected through our project, and it enables the analysis and visualization of this data, as you can see through these rather fab graphics here. Our aim is to make it open access so that anyone, anywhere can use the data that we generate. Using just one object, the Akan drum, I'm going to give you an example of how this works and what looking at Sloane's collections from very different perspectives and integrating these perspectives into the project involves in practice. Now, Sloane's catalogue notes that the drum was a, quote, Indian drum, collected in Virginia by one Mr. Clerk before it entered his collection. Historic writing on the drum itself also notes, quote, a drum from Virginia. This is the first surviving layer of information that we have about this Akan drum. The current British Museum record on Collection Online, you've got part of a screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen. That tells a very different story. Collaborative research by curators, historians and scientists over the last decade has revealed that this drum was in fact made in the region that is now Ghana in West Africa. So it's not a, quote, Indian or Native American drum at all. And it seems that the link to Native Americans in Virginia is simply factually incorrect. So that's a second layer of information. Now, even more recent research suggests that there might actually be a link between the drum and Native Americans after all, because Native Americans owned enslaved people in Virginia, and Mr. Clerk, whoever he might be, may have got the drum from Native Americans. And this would explain why the drum was linked with them, and it also tells us that the drum probably came to America alongside enslaved West Africans through the transatlantic slave trade. So now we have additional layers of information. So many stories converge on just one single object. Anyone interested in topics as wide-ranging as the transatlantic slave trade, including Native American involvement, Afro-American and West African music and musical instruments, West African ecological histories through the materials the drum was made with, collecting and collecting histories, the list goes on and on. In the next year or so, the Akan drum is going to be displayed, rather redisplayed, it is currently on display in a separate gallery, in the Enlightenment Gallery here in the British Museum as part of a Sloane Lab redisplay developed in collaboration with interested communities. Our team will be working with community members to think about what this object means to them and what stories our collaborative work will surface for this display. Our work will also explore what this project, this process, and this object tells us about museums and society more generally today. All of this adds many more layers of rich data to the drum and the many, many stories, old and new, that converge on it and are generated through it. It'll be fascinating to see which stories our collaborative work will surface and display, so do come back and visit us again next autumn. Capturing this wide range and type of information and integrating it into the Sloane Lab knowledge base is both a technical and conceptual challenge, and it's important because it means other people can build on it. Now, I've given you one example out of tens of thousands of objects and specimens, so you can just imagine the kind of other stories that are connected with every single object, and also between the objects. What does the future hold beyond the Sloane Lab? We must recognise absences and help people using Sloane's collections to recognise these absences as well. Many of the objects listed in Sloane's catalogues have not survived, and nor have some of the catalogues themselves. So, when we put together these massive cross-institutional digital collections, the totality of Sloane's collections will simply not be there. They will never be there. One of the dangers of this is that people using the digital collections may assume that they are complete, and such assumptions have implications for the integrity of their research. The Akan drum didn't magically appear in Sloane's home, and nor did any of the tens of thousands of the things that he acquired. He relied on extensive global networks, developing British power, and hundreds, if not thousands, of deeply knowledgeable people from around the world to put together his enormous collection of collections and to acquire the knowledge that accompanied them. The Sloane Lab project team is doing important work in fostering conversations about the many absences that the collection holds, and we can draw attention to this reality in the digital context as well, because often these conversations focus on the physical museum, while the Sloane Lab project can bring attention to how the digital arena can re-inscribe and re-amplify absence in an innovative way. So while our project cannot restore all individual absences, we can draw attention to what is missing, excluding, and contested, while opening new possibilities for communities to engage with the digital collection so new stories can be told, some of which may indeed address and contest historical absence and exclusion. And these, I think, are our future challenges. Thank you very much.